Given my EXCO capacity, maybe it would be better to listen to what other speakers have to say. But I'm happy to kickstart the discussion. I think what I will do is to try to highlight areas which I think are important. I'm not going to repeat some of the commentaries made by various people over the last few days. Now, let me start by showing you this sheet of paper. I was shown, or rather we were shown this piece of paper when I attended a forum on the Chief Executive's Price Address last Saturday, organized by the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups. So one of the speakers was a high school, I think a university student. So she put up this sheet of paper and asked the audience, what do you see? What do you see? Purple dot, yeah? Okay. Any other views?
Piece of paper.
Right.
Nobody would see the light.
Right. So the point made by her was, it's not just a dot. Actually, it's more than that, right? But most people would focus on the dot. And she used that example to bring out her critical views about the policy address. And that is that the policy address somehow is focused on certain things but has not covered other things. And when it came to my turn to give some feedback, I said, well, what about the community looking at the policy address? Are we also focusing on the dot and neglect the rest of the paper? Because if we look at the comments made over the last few days, particularly the first day, actually much of the discussion was about old age allowance. The fact that the Chief Executive has not responded sufficiently to proposals made by legislators and various groups. So suddenly the whole address is about old age allowance. Now, I'm not trying here to defend the policy address, but I'm trying to see what else is in the policy address. I can see some things, some areas which somehow has escaped a serious response from the community. Let me list some of the areas which I have seen. First of all, in terms of the concerns of the community, the Chief Executive has said, well, he sees that there are three major concerns: the financial crisis, food safety, and environmental pollution. And I remember in the past, when I was one of the commentators, and very often we used to criticize the policy address as simply like a rolling account of the activities conducted by various government departments. It's just a long list of activities. And we used to criticize the policy address of previous governors for lacking a direction. What we wanted at that time to say, we want a direction. We don't want just a descriptive account of what you are doing. And then, but more recently, whether it's about the policy address or the budget, somehow the community has looked for what newspapers describe as sweetness, or pai tong in Cantonese. Okay, 你冇糖派俾我, right? But I think I would rather prefer the policy address not just about distributing sweetness. I would prefer the policy address to really tell the community whether the Chief Executive sees the challenges or the crisis facing the community in much the same way as the rest of the community. In other words, are we looking at the same problems, and whether the Chief Executive has got some ideas, some solutions, if you like, to deal with those problems. And I can see that there are some new things in the policy address which somehow has not been sufficiently commented on over the last few days. Now, much of the discussion is about OH allowance. Now, personally, I do not think that the OH allowance as it stands should be subject to a means test, because the OH allowance is really about respecting the elderly. I mean, it's not really means tested when it was first introduced. But of course, the chief executive has tried to say, well, if we make this sort of an entitlement in the long run, and then the community is aging, are we able to bear the financial consequence? Now, I think that can always be fully debated in society. It's so easy for him to say, okay, let's make it an entitlement. Now, he's unwilling to do that. Now, for the reason he put it, I mean, he doesn't want to leave a great financial burden to the next generation. Now, whether this is the case, I think that can always be fully debated. But this is not just the gist of the policy address. I can also name the introduction of minimum wage. Now, that has been campaigned for over the last few years, and in 2005, when Mr. Cheung assumed the office of chief executive, in fact, in his first policy address after he became chief executive, he said he's willing to consider having minimum wage. But he said he would prefer that to be done on a voluntary basis. But if the voluntary movement failed, then he would consider legislation. Now, but at that point, there are some legislators from trade unions who said, well, the chief executive is not serious about introducing minimum wage. But on the record, I think people can check, I wrote an article in Ming Pao and also perhaps in SCMP as well. I said, well, that the chief executive has gone on a path of no return, because once the so-called voluntary movement doesn't work, then he's obliged to introduce legislation. This is exactly what's happening. Then you have people who said, well, the chief executive has not actually said how much is the minimum wage. But if you look at all the other jurisdictions that have minimum wage, you always have a commission. You have the employers, the unions, and sometimes you have government representatives, a tripartite commission looking into how the minimum wage should be determined. And I think that should be the right way. Right? You don't want government to say, well, this is the minimum wage. But then, of course, you have people who criticize the policy address for lacking a figure. I don't think this is as simple as that. It's not as simple as just giving a figure. Competition law, this is already on the agenda. The importance of food safety. So government is going to introduce some legislation to enhance the current measures on food safety. The policy address has not gone into great depth, but you can notice that cooperation between Hong Kong and Guangdong and cooperation between Hong Kong and Taiwan has now come onto the agenda, particularly the Hong Kong-Taiwan dimension, which was something that sort of shied away from the government agenda in the past because of the tense cross-strait relations. But this is now very much on the agenda. I think that is also important. What is more important, in my view, is that the government has now finally come to realize that there is a role for government to play, a positive role for government to play. Now, although the chief executive still maintains that the principle of small government, big market is to be adhered to, but I think we should not make that